What is it that makes you want to play a video game? This is an entirely subjective question, of course. I'm sure everyone's answer will be tied to the types of games they enjoy and what it is that attracts them to certain genres in the first place. But for me, it has always been the game's concept. Whether that's the idea of delivering packages through a vast mountain range in Death Stranding, or fighting the powers of darkness with my favorite Disney characters in Kingdom Hearts, the core concept of a game has always been what draws me in. So back in 2007, when I was about 13 years old, the idea of playing as a guy possessed by the demonic powers of evil definitely had me interested.
Through you, I am born.
So what is The Darkness? Well, The Darkness is a first-person action horror game developed by Starbreeze Studios, where you play as Jackie Estacado, a 21-year-old guy who has just recently discovered that he's actually the host of a demonic presence with a passion for devouring hearts and causing a lot of chaos. The game was released back on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 and was generally seen as a success by both journalists and players alike. The game plays out as a story-driven first-person shooter in which Jackie must fight against his adoptive uncle Paulie, the head of a New York crime mob, and figure out how to deal with his newfound powers. Gameplay is typically split between exploration and combat, where Jackie can combine a variety of guns with his darkness powers to defeat anyone who gets in his way.
I've heard people complain that life is unpredictable. Well, I never had a life that was predictable. But what happened to me today? That's why I need you, Jenny.
The exploration side of gameplay is pretty basic by today's standards, but at the time it was quite impressive that you were able to explore the subway stations and streets of the city above and talk to everyone you met along the way. These sections, though mostly entirely optional, helped to create a really dense, oppressive atmosphere. One of the developers' biggest achievements with this game was definitely the atmosphere. Everything was so somber and even depressing at times. It really makes you feel as if you're stuck in this very dark, dangerous environment, especially during the combat sections. The tranquil moments that you experience in the subway stations, combined with the melancholic score, really help to maintain a really strong atmosphere throughout. There is one scene that really stuck with me where you go to your girlfriend Jenny's apartment and can sit and watch TV with her. The TV will actually show entire movies, such as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and even old TV show episodes and music videos, and it really just lets you sit there and watch the entire thing uninterrupted. Small moments like these are what really help to elevate this game above just being a straightforward shooter.
It's good having you here. It's kind of calming. I'm always calm when you're here. I can feel your heartbeat.
When the game does let loose and turn into a shooter, the gameplay becomes a little more mixed in terms of quality. The combat can be split into two parts, guns and your darkness powers. Jackie spends a majority of the game either dual-wielding pistols and submachine guns or carrying a shotgun. Using these guns is as simple as pointing and shooting. There's no aiming down the sights or weapon upgrades. It's all very straightforward and functional, if a little boring at times. Where the combat really comes alive is with your darkness powers. You're quite literally taking power from darkness, so you'll be spending a lot of your time shooting out lights and sticking to the shadows in order to use them. Your powers consist of demon arms that can stab enemies in front of you or be controlled manually to enter smaller areas to stealth kill enemies or unlock doors. Darkness guns, which consist of a submachine gun and a shotgun or a shockwave style gun, and they technically have infinite ammo as long as you stay in the shadows to maintain your darkness energy. Later in the game you can also unlock a black hole ability, which more or less clears out an entire room of enemies and light sources in one go. And finally, there are minions that you can summon. There are 4 types. a melee fighting berserker, the ranged attacking gunner, the self-destructing kamikaze, and the light source killing light killer. These can all be summoned from portals that you'll find around the place and can help you clear out enemies, open certain doors for you, and just generally cause chaos. They also like to pee on the bodies of enemies, so there's that too. All of these abilities use darkness as a resource, which you can refill by sticking to the shadows. You can also devour the hearts of enemies that you've killed, which works as a sort of XP system, allowing you to level up your darkness level, which means more energy for your abilities and damage resistance when using the darkness. Overall, using your darkness powers is what really makes the game fun to play, and you can really get a power trip out of taking down waves of enemies using your powers and watching them panic when they see you coming. It's just a bit of a shame that the actual gunplay in the game hasn't aged all that well. It really feels pretty basic when put alongside much more interesting powers with the darkness.
I remember the night of my 21st birthday. That was the first time I died.
So now we're going to get into story territory, so if you really want to play this game and you haven't yet, skip to this time on screen if you want to skip any spoilers. So like I said earlier, you play as Jackie Estacado, an orphan who was adopted by Paulie, who just so happens to be the head of the New York crime mob. On his 21st birthday, Jackie is sent on a job for Paulie, but of course things go wrong and Jackie ends up with a bounty getting put on his head. Luckily for Jackie, this also happens to be when he discovers his new darkness powers, so he decides to fight back against Paulie and take down this crime ring once and for all. Side note, almost no one ever acknowledges Jackie's powers throughout the first half of the game, which is really jarring considering he's walking around with giant demon tentacles coming out of his back. It's not a huge flaw or anything, enemies still react during gameplay, but I found it pretty funny how Jackie gets these powers and now has this creepy voice in his head, and his first thought is just, hey, that's weird, anyway, better go visit my girlfriend and act like nothing strange is happening, everything's fine. Anyway, after escaping his attempted assassination at the beginning of the game, Jackie ends up back in his girlfriend Jenny's apartment. Jenny was at the same orphanage as Jackie, so the two have known each other for a long time. Jackie tries to keep Jenny out of this life of crime that he has, and if you know basic crime story writing, then you know that's probably not going to turn out too well. The non-darkness related storyline does come across as pretty predictable, if I'm honest. If you've watched The Godfather or any crime TV show, it's all pretty straightforward. So Jackie continues to work to destroy Paulie's operation, which of course ends up in Paulie blowing up your old orphanage and taking Jenny hostage as a means of revenge against you. So you go back to the destroyed orphanage where Paulie and Eddie, a corrupt cop who works for Paulie, have taken Jenny. They end up executing Jenny while the darkness restrains Jackie to make him watch, which results in Jackie taking his own life out of grief. This is where the game's story takes a sharp left turn away from all the Godfather knockoff plotlines and goes all World War mode through a Hellraiser style filter. See, Jackie ends up in a weird hell world known simply as the Otherworld, which seems to be where the darkness originated. It's here where the game flexes more of its horror muscles and starts having enemies look like they stumbled over from the Call of Duty Zombies set. It's in these sections of the game where I feel like the developers were allowed to be a lot more creative. The visual design works really well and fits perfectly with your darkness powers. Everything has this really dirty, violent look to it. Jackie also learns that the darkness is actually a curse that was set on his family and that he'll need to overcome its influence to free himself of it and gain full control of his powers. Jackie eventually escapes the Otherworld and ends up back in New York, where he immediately starts to hunt down Eddie in order to get to Paulie. These sections play out as before, but Jackie ends up getting himself captured, tortured, and eventually killed by Eddie, sort of. Because of course Jackie actually ends up back in the Otherworld, where he storms the Darkness's castle and fights for control against it in a pretty awesome boss fight sequence. The design of Darkness Jackie is pretty hardcore. Eventually Jackie succeeds and comes back to life again, and now has full control of the darkness. And so we get to the final section of the game and can finally get around to taking down Paulie. Jackie eventually makes his way to Paulie's mansion, which of course just happens to be beside a lighthouse, and the darkness ends up doing most of the work, which is a shame because the game ends up almost lacking an end fight altogether. But you do eventually find Paulie, who begs for his life, but as you can imagine, Jackie doesn't really care at this stage, so you kill him and the game comes to an end. There is also a short epilogue section in which Jackie talks to Jenny, but then she tells him that it isn't his time, and so he returns to the land of the living and the game cuts to black. So where does that leave the darkness now? Well, unfortunately, no one really talks about this game anymore. It was successful at the time and definitely one of the more unique games to come out back in 2007, but it was eventually overshadowed by a lot of other games from the same year. For example, The Darkness had the unfortunate luck of coming out the same year as BioShock, Call of Duty 4, and Halo 3. So the shooter fans had the likes of Call of Duty and Halo to keep them busy, and the narrative and horror fans had BioShock. I think BioShock is an interesting comparison, as both games featured a narrative-driven experience with first-person shooting as the main combat mechanic, with powers to go along with it. But BioShock went down in history as one of the most influential and successful games of all time, whereas The Darkness has all but disappeared. I think one of the main reasons for this, besides the hype surrounding BioShock being a lot higher, would be that BioShock had a much more interesting world and aesthetic. On the surface, a lot of the marketing for The Darkness focused too much on the mob storyline, which was, and still is, a very generic setup for a story, regardless of how cool the rest of the game ended up being. Jackie also ended up being a pretty forgettable protagonist. Sure, his story was interesting, but as a character he never really came across as being that interesting. A lot of the cutscenes in the game are just him monologuing to himself or other characters, without really any emotion or enthusiasm, so players didn't really have anyone that they could build a connection with. Another hit to the game's legacy is also how difficult it is to find these days. You see, the game never got a HD remaster or re-release, or even a PC port, so unless you go to a secondhand game store or have a friend who is particularly passionate about this game, the chances of you stumbling upon it are just extremely low. So you can technically play the game using PlayStation Now, a streaming service on the PlayStation 4 and PC, which is what I did for this video, but it does rely a lot on your internet quality since you have to stream the game, which isn't ideal for a lot of people, but it is an option if you don't have a PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360 lying around. The game did end up getting a sequel in 2012, which actually did get a PC release, but it was a little too late in the end. Sure, the sequel is still great and definitely improves on the gameplay, but it lost a lot of the atmosphere and style that the original had. YouTubers had made games like Amnesia dominate the horror genre, and first-person shooters had just grown and evolved so much that almost every game had some kind of power or upgrade mechanic, and by 2012 the idea of playing a first-person horror game, or even a game with interesting powers at your disposal, just wasn't the kind of concept that was unique enough to sell a game anymore, and so The Darkness faded into, well, darkness.
Am I dreaming?
Yes. You have to wake up now.